how did he get from that first trial essentially to building this strict protocol that eventually it had global hooks? He was instructing other doctors and scientists on how to do this across the country and across the world.
Gottlieb organized MK Ultra very methodically. He recognized that the CIA itself did not have resources to conduct these kinds of experiments. It doesn't have clinics or hospitals. It cannot requisition patients. So he set out to create essentially two networks, one inside the United States and one outside. So the network inside the United States was based on contracting doctors at prison hospitals and other medical institutions, including psychiatric hospitals. He contracted with some doctors, for example, who treated psychiatric patients for relatively minor afflictions like depression or postpartum problems. And once those patients were in the grip of these psychiatrists or psychologists who were working for MK Ultra, they would become guinea pigs for these horrific experiments. Others, I mentioned, were taking place in prisons. For example, Gottlieb wanted to know if heavy doses of LSD would ultimately destroy a human mind. So we have a protocol, one of the few that gets rescued by indirect means from the MK Ultra record destruction, that tells us about an experiment that happened at the federal prison in Lexington, Kentucky. So 7 African-American inmates were segregated and given what were described as triple and quadruple doses of LSD every day for 77 days.
Jesus.
Without being told what was happening to them. So these were really horrific, and I've often wondered about that one. I'm sure those poor guys, if they lived at all, never knew what happened to them. They probably died without having an inkling that they were subjects of a diabolical experiment directed by an official of the U.S. government. So these kinds of experiments were going on in many parts of the United States and even in Canada. Then Gottlieb expanded his network and began working in secret prisons, essentially, or detention centers in other countries, particularly in Germany, in the Philippines, and other parts of East Asia. While I was researching this book, I discovered what I think might be the first CIA secret prison. It's in a lovely chalet at the end of a lane, not so far from Frankfurt. And the guy who now owns it, who's an entrepreneur who's made it into a few lovely condos, took me down into the basement. And he said, these are the cells where the CIA doctors carried out those experiments that were actually only extensions of the experiments that the Nazi doctors were conducting only a few years earlier, right down the road.
So it's an old CIA torture house, essentially. This is where they used to conduct the experiments.
Der Spiegel, the German news magazine, described it exactly this way. They had an article about this house, and they said this was the CIA torture house. And this entrepreneur who's now bought the house told me that the people in the neighborhood are fully aware of what went on there and have told him that the bodies of people who were experimented to death in that basement were buried in forests nearby in places that are now covered over by shopping malls and apartment blocks.